Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and I apologize. I'm getting a little bit of a cold, so I hope I don't do too much coughing or anything. And there's so much to cover, so I apologize. I'll try not to go on and on. This was originally going to be mostly about my book and the general situation, but of course now with Gaza, I'll be speaking about that as well. We've received, as you've seen, in the last week or 2 weeks, we often receive a lot of reporting about Israel-Palestine, certainly in the US media, which is my expertise. So some aspects we learn about again and again. For example, Palestinian rockets. Every news report in the US, and I expect it was the same here, that ever mentioned anything about Gaza always mentioned the rockets. That was the context that was always there. Thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza. The New York Times, for example, a few years ago had a photograph of what looked like terrorists shooting a rocket against Israel. Given that they give us that information so often about thousands of rockets from Gaza, they tell us so little about them. For example, even the New York Times did, in this one case, buried at the very end of a long story, admit that they were almost always large, small, homemade projectiles. That's changed a bit, but through all these years that everybody's been hearing about thousands of rockets, we're talking about homemade projectiles. Now let's ask another question that the media could easily include with their context, a very short little statement. How many people have they killed in Israel? Well, it's not difficult to find out. You know, CBS and CNN and could all find this out. Since 2001, the last I counted, these rockets have killed a total of 29 Israelis. It sounds like many of you know, that is fewer than the number of Palestinians sometimes killed in a few minutes. So that's the total time since spring of 2001, the total number. As fair-minded people, I would think Canadians and Americans would want to know, well, how many Gazans were killed by Israeli forces during this same period of time? And that number also is not difficult to get, 5,700 Gazans. Last week, that was 4,700. So some aspects are well covered again and again. For example, when Israeli children are killed, a tragedy, we hear about them. We often know their names. We grieve with their parents. We almost never hear about Palestinian children who were killed during that period. We don't know their names. We don't grieve with their parents. We're not told about them. It's my view that we should hear about all of them. How did I become involved? I don't happen to be Jewish or Palestinian or Muslim or Arab. Why am I suddenly working on this issue? What happened with me is about 14 years ago, like most, certainly of Americans, I knew almost nothing about this issue. To me, it was distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life. But then in fall of 2000, a little bit like now, for a while the Israel-Palestine was in the news. It was the second intifada, as it's called, Palestinian uprising. I don't know why they use intifada. We're speaking English. Why not just use a word we'll understand that's not alien to us? So that began, and I decided to pay attention and just follow the news and understand what it was all about. And when I did that, my background is journalism. At that time, I was the editor of a very small weekly newspaper in Northern California. I quickly noticed we were getting one-sided coverage. That caused me to look into it more and more. And after a while, I became so outraged at what I began to discover about this issue that I should have known all of those decades of my life and my own negligence in not knowing it. And the cover-up I saw going on in the US media that I decided it was so significant, I quit my job in Sausalito, and I traveled over to the West Bank and Gaza as a freelance reporter in February and March of 2001, long before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. And I'll show you a little bit of what I saw. I saw normal people who love their children, families. I traveled very randomly and haphazardly throughout the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I saw beautiful agricultural lands and people living on those lands. And I saw a great deal more. I saw what was happening to those people. People would invite me to stay in their homes at times, and I gladly accepted that. And then I saw the rest of what was going on. This is Gaza in 2001, long before Hamas was elected and before any rockets had been fired. This is the Tufa area of Khan Yunis. I saw entire residential neighborhoods that were bullet-riddled. I saw Israeli shelling was going on every night, in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank in some parts. There was shelling every night. I remember going around thinking, I should roll up the windows. And I thought, no, that doesn't do very much against shelling. I saw children living there. I saw families trying to live there. I saw what they had done is they had, the lucky people had abandoned their homes. They just lost their home that sheltered them in their old age. That was sheltering their family. They at least had somewhere else to go. But many people were still living in these homes. They had mattresses in the center or somewhere that they hoped would be safe, where they hoped they wouldn't get killed. And then at one point, there was suddenly Israeli gunfire very near me. We all ducked, and they took me away from that area and to safety. As I wrote later, I didn't think this had anything to do with me. It was just a coincidence. But as I thought about it further, a little later, I realized that was a very naive assessment. As I was going around this area, I would occasionally peek over sandbag barricades and out shuttered windows, and I could see Israeli guard towers overlooking us. And I have no doubt that those Israeli soldiers saw that a foreigner was wandering around, and I suspect they finally decided to send her a message. Don't see what we're doing. Don't come to Palestine. I saw beautiful agricultural lands next to the beautiful blue Mediterranean Sea that were being destroyed. I talked to farmers who had farmed there forever. Their fathers, their grandfathers had farmed that land. And now their crops were destroyed, their orchards were destroyed, and I wondered how they would feed their children. How do you feed your children when everything is destroyed? And this was in early 2001, before it got bad. I also saw much more. I don't like seeing suffering. I especially don't like to see children in pain. But since thousands of children have been injured through the use of my US tax money, it was my job to see them. And it wasn't difficult. All I had to do was go to the nearest hospital. And I saw children with bullets in their back, in their stomach, in their teeth, in their chests, in their legs, in their head. I saw a brain-dead little 12-year-old. His crime had been throwing stones at invading soldiers. I won't go into everything that I saw, but I will recall at one point I went to a Palestinian newspaper office with sandbags against the bullets that Israeli forces shoot against newspaper offices. And when I first got there, they said a 9-year-old boy was just shot nearby. Maybe you'd like to go see, since I was a reporter. And I thought, no, I wouldn't like to go see. But I did. And I saw where the little boy had been sitting watching his father paint the wall, like kids do. I saw the wet paint, I saw the toy trucks, I saw the blood on the floor. I saw the wall hanging in the living room that had a bullet hole in it that said, I'm told, thinking of God makes our hearts grow calm. I saw the needlepoint over the front door that I could read myself. It said, God bless our home. The family had moved in 10 days before. This was sort of their dream house. I saw the flowers in the living room, the family photos on the wall, and I saw the parents when they got home from the hospital. I heard the mother and the sisters weeping and weeping and weeping. And I saw the father walking around shell-shocked. It looked to me like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that will never end. I saw the neighbors come in to try to comfort them. I heard a man tell the father when it looked like he was about to break down, your son is a bird in heaven now. And the next day there was another funeral for a woman who had been killed. She had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12. And as I went around interviewing people, I found myself at one point next to a woman who lived next to the dead woman, who was her close friend. And she told me about her friend. This woman had gone to college in the US. She said that just a few days before, her friend had been asking her what it was like to go to college in the US. because she said that her oldest son, the 18-year-old, wanted to go to college in the US. In fact, she said it's every boy's dream in Palestine to go to college in the US. But she said, of course, he won't go now. He'll stay home to help with his brothers. And on later trips, I saw a wall being built on Palestinian territory. I saw the Kafkaesque way you get out of Bethlehem if you're allowed out of that prison. And then I went back to Gaza in about 2010, I think it was, and this is what it looked like that time. And the West Bank, this is what it looked like. So when I returned from this trip, I began an organization called If Americans Knew. And I've actually had quite a few countries say if, it should be extended to lots of countries. So I formed that organization, and we especially decided to look at the media, because I think the most powerful institution in a nation where we vote for our elected representatives are the news organizations. They are telling people what goes on, people think. It forms their views. So we conducted media studies of some major and less important newspapers and general media. And we especially, my son is a scientist. I like the idea of a scientific study as much as possible, something that would choose a category of significance that was quantifiable and as immune to subjective bias as possible. So we decided to look at how the media covered deaths among both populations. To me, all of those deaths are tragic. We especially looked at the first year of the uprising because first impressions are so powerful. They set the context within which people view a conflict. We needed to ask how many people were killed that first year, and we especially looked at a subcategory, children's deaths, because I think we're all especially horrified and saddened when children are killed, and that is especially newsworthy. So using an Israeli source to see how many children had been killed that first year, beginning in fall of 2000, when the cycle of violence began, we discovered that it was 28 Israeli children and 131 Palestinian children. How was this covered by US primetime network news shows? Well, they reported on Israeli children's deaths at rates up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on Palestinian deaths. They reported on Palestinian deaths so minimally that many people didn't even know they were going on. Then there are other media too. Another group did a study of National Public Radio, NPR. Many people feel that's a more intellectual, more reliable source of information than the commercial media. They are consistently attacked in the US by Israel partisans as being supposedly pro-Palestinian in their reporting. So Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, an excellent media watchdog group, decided to look into their coverage. And they discovered that, yes, indeed, NPR is very distorted in how it covers this issue, but once again in a pro-Israel direction. The researcher Seth Ackerman gave his study a brilliant title. He called it The Illusion of Balance, because NPR had carried almost the exact same number of news reports on Israeli children's deaths as on Palestinian children's deaths. Of course, that didn't mean it was balanced. That meant that they reported on almost all the deaths among one population and very few among another population. A typical US daily newspaper is the San Jose Mercury News. That was sort of nearby, so we did a study of that one, but just a typical daily newspaper. In this case, we just looked at front page headlines because many people are so busy. That might be all that we'll skim, at least, the front page headlines. And after all, those are the big news of the day. That's the important news. So to study that, we needed a baseline. How many people from both populations were killed during that study period? And again, using an Israeli source, these numbers are not disputed. We discovered that it was 121 Israelis and 384 Palestinians. How was this covered in these front page headlines of a typical newspaper? Probably this is how most of them covered it. They reversed the situation and even increased the differential. So the people saw lots and lots of front page headlines about Israeli deaths and very few about Palestinian deaths. I was astounded. It occurred to me to really reverse it. it occurred to me that what if the Mercury News had gotten the World Series wrong? What if they had reported the Super Bowl backwards? There would have been jokes about them by late-night comedians. And here they were committing a distortion of that magnitude, having to do with lives and deaths, and no one noticed it. As I'm sure many of you know, we often see the headline or the phrase, "A period of relative calm has been shattered by Palestinian violence." Again and again, we hear a period of calm was shattered or violated by Palestinian, violence. This was one example that happened in 2005. I was living in Los Angeles at that time, and I saw this on their website. So it was late afternoon, early evening, before the paper was printed the next day. So I called them up to correct that before they actually printed such an inaccurate headline. Because I told them that during this period of relative calm, as they were calling it, 170 Palestinian men, women, and children had been killed. And during a period they said was calm, 379 had been injured, some maimed horrifically. Their response to me was, "We said relative calm." And not a word changed in their story. There's so many other omissions. I'll just give one, even though it's to do with the US, but it's very significant, I think, in the degree of cover-up going on. This occurred, it's a very different situation. This took place on Capitol Hill in 2003. There was a report by an independent commission that in the Rayburn House Office building right on Capitol Hill. The chairman of the commission was Admiral Thomas Moore, a retired four-star admiral. He had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the United States. He was a World War II hero. Also with him on the panel was Rear Admiral Merlin Starring, who had been head of the whole legal department of the US Navy. Part of their commission was a Marine general, and not just any Marine general. This was the man who was the highest ranking Medal of Honor recipient in the United States. That's the highest medal one can receive. They announced their findings on Capitol Hill in 2003 that Israel had tried to sink a US Navy ship, that they had killed 34 Americans, injured over 170 of them, that the decks were running with blood. They announced that this was an act of war by Israel against the United States. They announced that this was covered up by order of the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. Statements of that magnitude made on Capitol Hill by officials of that high rank are newsworthy. And yet none of them, they weren't covered. Nothing in the Washington Post next door, nothing in the so-called patriotic network, Fox News, nothing in the New York Times, nothing in USA Today. You could, in the US military newspaper abroad, the Stars and Stripes covered it. And it's in the congressional record. Now let's look at these recent Gaza conflicts. I'll just do this briefly. But let's look at what happened in 2009 and 2010. Those are the number of people that are killed in what they call a war. I would call that a massacre. I think we should use words clearly and precisely and not exaggerate them, but that to me does not look like a war. Then a few years later, there was another war against Hamas. But it's not Hamas that's getting killed, it's men, women, and children. It's hospitals that are being destroyed, schools, entire civilian infrastructure. So 2012, they had one of their operations called Pillar of Defense. And these are the numbers. In fact, this was, afterwards we found there were even more Palestinians killed because several died of their injuries a little bit later. Even more of all ages, even more children were killed. Now we have 2014 and it's going on again. And the world is, somehow we're letting it happen again. So let's look at this because, again, I always look at the media. Because if people knew, I do think we would be stopping it and saving lives, Palestinian and Israeli lives. So the media date this most recent massacre, this as occurring because basically they sort of begin the coverage of when the 3 young Israeli settlers were abducted and sadly murdered. Well, let's see where this could start. Let's look at the violence of 2014. And in the next slides, I'll show you the Israeli deaths on one side, on the left side, and the Palestinian deaths on the right side. So first we'll look at January. No Israeli deaths. Next we'll look at February. No Israeli deaths, so no news. Next we'll look at March. No Israeli deaths, and the small green one is a child. Next we'll look at the next month, April. We see 1 Israeli soldier killed and a Palestinian. Then we'll look at May, and we see no Israeli deaths. We see 2 Palestinian children and a Palestinian adult. Then we look at June. You know, when you see the whole, then we'll look at July. Wow. The slide had to be very small, you know, to hold all of those Palestinian deaths, and that's only up through the 21st. It's much higher than that now. But this is the timeline, but they only start it when there are Israelis killed. That's when it always starts. So to the average intelligent person who doesn't think that they're being fooled by the media, they think Israel is always retaliating, that Israel is always defending its population, because the first they've heard of anybody killed are Israelis. And you can go back, anybody can do this research, it's not difficult. You can go back and look at this and find when there are periods of lull. In truces, an MIT professor did a study and found that it was something like 96% of the time, the party that resumed violence, that killed the other party first, was Israel. But if you only hear about, you know, the clock always starts from Israeli deaths, it always looks like retaliation. So even today, when a great many people, I think now that's well over 1,000, I don't know the latest numbers, I'm sure in the last hour it's gone up. Many people, I think, are now noticing, isn't this a disproportionate killing of Palestinians? But they still think, oh, it's a response, without knowing, no, the killing of Palestinians came before the abduction, long before. They think it's a response to rockets. They don't know, no, the killing of Palestinians came before the rockets. At least 35 people had been killed in 2001, before a single rocket was fired. By the way, I think in terms of abducted people, the three Israelis were abducted, and while about 5 or 6 years ago, 1 Israeli soldier was abducted. Those were major news stories. This year, from just January 1st through May 31st, approximately 2,500 Palestinians were abducted by Israeli forces. And then even more after that. It's probably around 3,000, I would guess. But again, we don't hear those. So when I began to look into this back in fall of 2000, and when I went there in February, March of 2001, and when I came back and started to really study this issue, I wondered, well, when did all this start? What's it all about? And why does my country have such a uniquely special relationship with this tiny little country with no resources in the Middle East that keeps involving us in war after war? So I started reading books, book after book after book. And when I would read a book, and I'd look at the footnotes to see where that information came from, and then I would get that book, and then I'd look at those footnotes and get those books. And I've now, the result is the book that some of you may buy. You'll see it has about 350 footnotes. I believe in that we should look at where the information comes from. Well, I discovered that some people think this was thousands of years old. No. Some people think, oh, it began in 47 or 48. No. It actually began about over a century ago. And my book is focused on the U.S., so I apologize, I'll be telling about the U.S. and not Canada, but that's what my book is. And what I discovered, and again, many of you know, but the average American does not know, I certainly did not know this before, that there was a movement. I mean, this is what was one of the things that was startling to me when I did my research, to discover I grew up in the US. Both of my parents did. My grandparents, on one side, go way back, others more recently. So here I'd grown up here, my parents had grown up here, and it turned out there was a political movement in my country, in the United States, that has profoundly impacted my country negatively. It has tragically impacted the Middle East, and it has dangerously impacted the whole world. And yet I had never even heard of that movement. It's called political Zionism. In fact, I would suggest if we go out on the streets here, and certainly if we go out in the streets in the US, and ask people, what is Zionism, what is political Zionism? Most people would probably say what I would have said. I think I've heard that term. What does it mean? I think I've heard something like that. And here it's a significant movement that no one's even heard of. We've heard of socialism, communism, fascism, etc. So Zionism was a movement to create a Jewish state in Palestine, beginning in the late 1800s. Palestine at that time was what we call now a multicultural country. It was about 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and about 5% Jewish. All living there quite well, all practicing their religions side by side as they had done for centuries. This is easily discoverable. So what happened to see the kind of dreadful violence we see now? Well, it did not come from that land. It came from this movement that began in Europe and in the US, and perhaps was present here, that was very present in the US beginning in the late 1800s. In 1887, by 1887 already, the ambassadorship to the Ottoman Empire was Jewish because of the importance of it to Zionism. By 1910, there were 20,000 Zionists in the US, and they were often professional people, lawyers, businessmen. It was already becoming, according to historians, it was already becoming a movement of significance in 1910, one to which congressmen already would listen that early, especially in the larger eastern cities. Then in 1912, there was a very significant development, not just for the US, it turns out, but for everyone really. A man named Louis Brandeis, a very prominent lawyer, very famous, very celebrated, became a Zionist. Within a year or two, he became, in fact, the head of World Zionism. He was then appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson in 1916. By the way, becoming head of World Zionism was a public position that was known among some people. I'm sure many people didn't notice it, but then he became a Supreme Court justice. Of course, that's the highest court of the land. And when you're Supreme Court justice, you're supposed to resign all of your affiliations, board memberships, etc., because you're supposed to be neutral. So Brandeis did officially resign his leadership, his position as head of World Zionism, but in reality, he continued directing it. A number of historians write that fact. His loyal lieutenants would come into the Supreme Court chambers, report to him. He would give them directions about what to do, and they would go out and carry them out. One of the people that reported to him was Felix Frankfurter, who went on to become another Supreme Court justice, another very celebrated one. I mean, most Americans could not name many of our past Supreme Court justices. But these are two that I could have. They were very famous, important men. This all was a shock to me. But it was in a number of books. There's, it's well known for anybody that's actually looked into this. But then there was more to it that was such a shock to me and so surprising that even though this is a long talk and I'm trying to make it short, I'll give you my sources directly so you can evaluate them. The first place I saw the next part I'm going to tell you was in a book called Israel in the Mind of America. It was published by a very mainstream establishment publisher. The author was a very mainstream author named Peter Gross, He had been the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. He had then been in Harvard for a number of years. He'd written a number of well-regarded establishment nonfiction books. This is considered a very reliable type of author, certainly not radical, certainly not fringe. So then I looked at where he had gotten his information that I found so startling, and I discovered it was from a scholarly journal. I looked at his footnote and I got the actual article from the journal that was called The Parushim, a secret episode in American Zionist history. It was published by the American Jewish Historical Quarterly in 1975. So then I looked at that. Well, who wrote it? Is this that's a reputable journal. But what about the author? Surely this is peer-reviewed, but still, who was the author? Well, it turns out it was Dr. Sarah Schmidt, who is still a professor in Israel at a major university. Her field of expertise is Zionism and American Zionism in particular. So this is where the information I'm going to give you came from. A few other places have this information, some of this information also. This was, according to these sources, an elitist secret society that worked to manipulate the American society to adopt Zionism. They went around, the idea was to go around the United States and spread the idea of Zionism as being a good thing, to plant ideas around the country. And that they would recruit people from Harvard, because that's where Brandeis was a leader in this. He wasn't the founder, but he was a major leader within this secret society. And this isn't, Skull and Bones or something. This isn't a fraternity that, college boys join. This was a Supreme Court justice being in this. There would even be an initiation ceremony for people that joined it. And in my book, I have the full quote, but they would be told by the inductor, "Until our purpose shall be accomplished, you will be fellow of a brotherhood whose bond you will regard as greater than any other in your life, dearer than that of family, of school, of nation." As early as November 1915, this is a direct quote, as you can see from Peter Gross's book, a leader of the Parushim went around suggesting that the British might gain some benefit from a formal declaration in support of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Those of you that have heard of the Balfour Declaration, that's very significant, might relate that. Now let's remember what was going on during this time period. What began in 1914 was World War I, a horrific war like all wars, full of death and carnage and tragedy. So this is what was going on. The British were fighting this war and losing massive numbers of men. I think we all have heard about that. In the first day of the Battle of the Somme, I believe they lost something like 60,000 men in one day of battle. So they were, of course, very worried that they were going to lose that war. Both the Germans and the British wanted to get the U.S. on their side, of course. The American public was that terrible thing, isolationist. They didn't want to go kill and be killed in a foreign country somewhere over nothing that had anything to do with them. And really, many people feel was a pointless war altogether. Woodrow Wilson won his election with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But of course, as you know, he didn't eventually. So what happened is that some Zionist leaders, and again, I don't think I've said this yet, Zionist is not a synonym for Jew. For most of these decades, in fact, all of this time I'm talking about, they were a very small proportion of the Jewish population in the U.S. The Jewish population, the large majority, was either non-Zionist or actively anti-Zionist. But the Zionist leaders, remember, it's a political ideology, were in Britain too. It was fairly, somewhat worldwide. And they went to the British government and said, well, we can help you get the U.S. into the war, they claimed. They said that our colleagues in the U.S., such as Louis Brandeis, who's close to Woodrow Wilson, these are the things they said. This is documented. that if you promise to enable our movement to get Palestine for a Jewish state after the war, because World War I wasn't just against the Germans, it was against the Ottoman Empire too. So if they won that, the British would be in charge of Palestine. So they made them this promise, and it was called a gentleman's agreement, that if the Zionists would promise to do that, help get the U.S. into the war, if the British would promise to then sort of facilitate their Zionist project. This is written about again in many books, even though I never learned any of this about my own country growing up. So the Balfour Declaration was actually fairly mild in what it said. It said His Majesty's government would view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Although what was written at the time was that they knew that home meant state. And to use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. They also tacked on it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. At this time, the non-Jewish communities were 90% of Palestine. But the Zionists were very excited about this Balfour Declaration. As I just learned from my colleague today, in fact, they would have, I think, a celebration of this anniversary every year because the Balfour Declaration was so important to the achievement of creating Israel. Now, was that the reason the U.S. entered the war? I don't know. I think it should be studied. There were many factors that we've heard about much more. The Lusitania, submarine warfare, the blockade, the Zimmerman letter, economic conditions, etc. But the fact that I've never even heard this bothers me. And the fact that the Zionists claimed they were the reason that the U.S. entered the war, and many British in the British government also believed that that was the reason. Now, after World War I, there was the Paris Peace Conference, when they then pushed for this Balfour wording to go into the Paris Peace Conference so that then Britain would be awarded the mandate to be in charge of Palestine, and then they would let massive immigration to take over Palestine, push out the people, and have it become a Jewish state. Jumping ahead now, so I won't run out of too much time, the precursor to today's Israel lobby, which is extremely powerful in the U.S. Even Fortune magazine usually puts just one of its entities, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. They call the second most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. And yet there are many more entities that are also a part of it, so it's very powerful. The precursor to that, all of this, of course, was leading up to that. But there was an organization called the American Zionist Emergency Council, AZEC, that was founded in about 1940. And by 1943, it had a massive amount of money with which to manipulate the American people. They had a budget of $500,000 in 1943. Now, this was a time when a loaf of bread cost a nickel. In addition to that money, they had maneuvered themselves into a position where they had access to a great deal more money, access to potentially $14 million in 1941 and $150 million by 1948. When you do the conversion, that's something like $1 trillion. You know, think of our organizations, our budgets. They had $1 trillion. And this was just one organization. It was a major one, but just one. And they used it very effectively. They targeted every sector of U.S. society. And again, they kept documents of what they were doing. They had annual reports of what they were doing. They targeted, this is what specifically listed what they did. They targeted congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, business and labor, Jewish war veterans. Every sector was targeted for propaganda. More than 400 local committees around the country were formed. They funded books and articles. They made them bestsellers. There were massive campaigns. They also worked very hard and effectively and somewhat successfully to manufacture Christian support. They revived a Christian organization with their money funneled into it, and it was an organization that had been founded in 1923 by a Zionist. Well, they revived this Christian organization with secret money coming from AZEC. There was another group that they also funded and put out there. The purpose was to push this with Christians as well, so that they would take up the cause. They subsidized books. There were Zionist books totaled 3,000 and 4,000 sales monthly during 44 to 45. They also formed front groups. This is now a different organizations. There are a number of organizations in the U.S. Now, during this time, we're now looking at the 30s and 40s in Palestine. There were organizations there of these Zionists that had gone there to create a Jewish state. Some went there and said, this is terrible, what we're doing is wrong. You know, and objective vociferously. One rabbi, I think, wrote back early on saying, I've seen the bride, meaning Palestine. I've seen the bride, she is beautiful, but she's married. But the Zionist project continued to come there with the idea of pushing them out and taking it over. So there were some Zionist terrorist organizations created called the Irgun and the Stern Gang. I'm sorry, I can't say the full names, but it turns out they had front groups in the U.S. that were raising money for them and weaponry for them. One of them put on major pageants in Washington, D.C., where Supreme Court justices attended. One of the leaders of one of these for the Irgun delegation, as it was called, was a man who went by the name Peter Bergson, but whose real name was Hillel Cook. He was running that one. Then I learned about another man who was a part of these various, sort of duplicitously named organizations that were really front groups for military groups in Palestine. One was named Rabbi Korf, but I didn't know his first name. And when you're writing a book, which is what I was doing by that time, you have to have the first name. But the places where I saw him mentioned in the books I had that had a few paragraphs and some information about him, none of them really had much about him, and none gave the first name. So I went online and searched, and finally found a UN report that told a bit about what he had planned to do and gave his first name. And then with that, with some more key words, I plugged those into my search bar, and suddenly they were returning PDFs of front-page newspapers in the U.S. from 1947. It turned out that he was, he's the one on the right. He was, had gone over to Paris as a member of the Stern Gang in Paris. And their plan was to bomb London. They were going to get a plane and drop homemade bombs, incendiary bombs, on the foreign ministry. Their first choice had been Parliament, but they were so angry at the foreign ministry because after World War II, and before, truthfully, British had tried to limit the immigration to Palestine, Jewish immigration, because it was causing major violence. So they had consistently tried to limit it somewhat. So the Zionists were furious about that, so they decided they would kill him. He was the leader of it, Rabbi Baruch Korf. The reason they didn't succeed is because they couldn't fly a plane, and they recruited a young American aviator who'd been something of an ace in World War II, a man named Reginald Gilbert, he was 26 years old, to fly the plane for them. He pretended to go along with it, but then secretly he went to the U.S. Embassy, and they went to the Paris Police and Scotland Yard and divulged the plan. So then he continued to go along with it for a week at considerable risk, because they, of course, would have killed him, or might have, certainly real risk that he would have been killed. But he did that, and then when they went to the airport to actually take off, then they were arrested. He had powerful friends in high places, and Korf eventually got off with nothing. So I was still very curious about this whole episode, kept looking into it more to see what had happened with Baruch Korf. And then I discovered that he had become good friends with Richard Nixon and had helped to influence Nixon's policies on the Middle East, and that Nixon sort of fondly called him his rabbi. Now, during all of this time, and I hope I can go on for a few more minutes, during all of this time, and I'll do this part quickly, but what's interesting is that many people were actively opposing Zionism during this time. Some of the most Celebrated pastors that were two of the most famous and respected were against it for religious reasons. Missionaries and well-known leaders. This was the man who was head of what became the American University of Beirut, even went to Paris to argue against the Balfour Declaration and argue on behalf of self-determination for the peoples of the region. One man who was a Dead Sea scholar wrote a wonderful book called Palestine is Our Business. And to hear, what he wrote back then, and here he is, sounds very radical, like, oh, this must be some radical person writing it. And he was a Dead Sea scholar who wrote that book. Diplomats, the Pentagon, all were against this too. Some of them actually even said the principles were wrong, and many said it would be damaging to the United States. There were many, pretty much all of their reports were recommending against supporting Zionism. Decade after decade. This was one under Taft. This is another, I won't go into all the details of this. But this was interesting. This was a commission that was sent by Wilson during the Paris peace talk period to go and see really what was going on in Palestine. They went there. They came back and said this would be a grave trespass on the rights of the people. Made very, very, very strong statements in the report, and it was buried until about 1923, until after it was all filled out. And one of the people who sabotaged them was Louis Brandeis. A CIA report said that this would endanger the interests of the Western powers. Dean Acheson, all of the top people were recommending against this. Supposedly the Cold War is why we did it, but here the top Cold Warrior was saying this is bad for the U.S. to support Zionism. The importance of the region was the oil. Israel doesn't have oil. The Gulf states have the oil, the Arabs have oil, and we had very close relations with them. The U.S. was especially respected because we had not been an empire there. The British had been, the French had been, they were disliked for those reasons, but we hadn't. And here our president was proclaiming self-determination and all those things. And so we had what we needed, close relations with the people with this strategic material called oil. But what was more significant then as now to all politicians from both parties in the US, anybody that's truly ambitious, that really wants to win, was to get elected. Much more important than what's best for your country, best for the world, best for humanity, is to get reelected. So Harry Truman said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, to all these people that were telling him not to do it. I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents. And he was in a close race with Dewey. Some of you may remember there's a famous headline. Dewey was taking the same stand for the same reason. As I mentioned before, there was the American Council for Judaism that was actively lobbying against what Zionists were doing. There were, the State Department was warning, among other things, that it would create bloodshed and chaos. They had these reports that really predicted what came, sadly, because the predictions were terrible, and it's just what happened. So what happened is the Zionists managed to push through a partition recommendation. And I'll just do this quickly for people who don't know it. But we're always told, again, the media narrative is that the Palestinians just turned down this chance, because they're so anti-Semitic. And here was this wonderful chance to, this partition recommendation. For some reason, they didn't accept it. Well, of course, what that was the United Nations telling them to give away half of their land. And it wasn't just half. It's usually, if it's mentioned at all, it sounds like it's half. It was actually 55 compared to 45. They'd be left with 45. Now, I don't know about Canada, but I know what Americans in the US would say if the UN told that to us. But this was 55% going to Zionists, even though after decades of immigration, there were only 30% of the population. And even though the intention had been to dispossess the people through buying up the land, which is legal, they had failed in doing that. The Jewish ownership originally was very urban, was about 1%, of the land. And after all these decades, sometimes funded by the Rothschild families and some good, good sources of funding, they had at most achieved 8% ownership. Most historians say they owned 5 to 6%. So this is not something that any normal population would ever accept. Rather than bringing peace, which was supposed to be its goal, because there had been increased violence, especially with all the immigration, and then under the Nazi Holocaust, more immigration, more violence. Rather than bringing a solution, rather than bringing peace, it brought an outright war, in which the Palestinians call it the Nakba, al-Nakba, the catastrophe, a massive humanitarian catastrophe. 750,000 men, women, and children, at least, forced very ruthlessly off their land, out of their homes, at least 33 massacres, 16 of the massacres occurring before a single Arab army had joined the fray. And I grew up with this myth that little Israel declared its independence, all these Arab armies fought it, Really, they had already committed 16 massacres of Palestinians, ethnically cleansed at least 200,000 people before the Arab armies came in. And even when they came in, they were smaller in number than Zionist forces. So this is now the end. There was a journalist, again, among the people that were trying to do something about this, was a journalist named Dorothy Thompson. The Britannica calls her one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century. In fact, I think they call her the most famous female journalist of the 20th century. And yet I had never heard of her. But she was enormously famous. She had had a newspaper column that was read, that was all over the United States, a radio program listened to by millions of Americans. She was the second most powerful woman after Eleanor Roosevelt. She was such a celebrity. She was married to a celebrity novelist. She was such a celebrity that there was a Broadway play and a Hollywood movie based loosely on her life, in which she was played by Katharine Hepburn and then Lauren Bacall. She had been a wonderful journalist. She had been a foreign correspondent in Germany in the 30s, and maybe right, when the Nazis were rising. And she was one of the first people to warn the world about what the Nazis were, to write about them and to raise the alarm. And she was, in fact, the first foreign journalist to be ejected by the Nazis, by Hitler. So then after the war, she was very sympathetic to Zionism. Then she went to this wonderful new country of Israel to see what it was like. And there, of course, she saw hundreds of thousands of refugees living in squalor, dying at high rates each day. And of course, she began to write about them, to speak about them. She eventually made a documentary about them. And for doing that, she was attacked massively. She lost her job. She lost her fame. And for doing that, she was erased from history. And today, if I tried to write an article from some of these very interesting stories that I discovered for American History magazine, for example, it's highly unlikely I would be able to get them to publish it. Because we tried to get them to publish a small paid advertisement for an autobiography by a 91-year-old former Republican congressman who wrote about depression era childhood, about being a small-town editor, about his service in the Navy in the Pacific, and about his time in Congress, and about how he was tried to talk about Palestine there and was targeted by the lobby and thrown out after 22 years in Congress. That paid advertisement that didn't tell any of that, just said, get this book the way advertisements are, and had some good endorsements of it. They would not put that in because that was anti-Israel. And in fact, they informed us, the publisher informed us, that he would not put our advertisement in any of the magazines that he owns. Weider Publications, by the way, they're from Canada, originally, now he's an American citizen, is the largest history chain in the United States, and their website claims in the world, which could well be true. So I hope you'll read my book and tell other people about it, because it'll take all of us to share this information. Thank you.